Welcome to the weekly DeSmogCAST, where we clear the PR pollution that clouds climate science and shed light on the biggest environmental news stories of the past week. This is the very first in what should be a weekly segment where we help spread environmental awareness as well as expose the dirty tricks of the dirty energy industry. Joining me for this week's discussion, we have Carol Linnitt, the Managing Editor and Director of Research for DeSmog Canada, Brendan DeMelle, Executive Director and Managing Editor for DeSmogBlog.com, and Steve Horn, Investigative Journalist and Research Fellow for DeSmogBlog. Guys, thanks for joining us this week. And Steve, I want to go ahead and kick things off with you. You had a great report come out this week, drilling deeper, kind of exposing some of the misinformation, I guess, coming from the fracking industry about their true numbers. Give us a quick rundown on what that story is about.
Well, yeah, so my story is basically a summary of a bigger report that was produced by the Post-Carbon Institute titled Drilling Deeper. It was written by David Hughes, who's a fellow at the Post-Carbon Institute and a guy who has lots of experience before working for an environmental group, working actually for the industry and working for a government agency in Canada doing this type of work, calculating what estimating what the future of energy resources is. And so if you look at this report, it second guesses a lot of the estimates that are being put out by the Energy Information Agency in the United States, which is part of the Department of Energy. And they look at estimates towards 2040 and look at all the 14 fields total, 7 gas, 7 oil. And Dave Hughes' numbers differ greatly from the EIA, even though they were both, I guess, looking at industry data. Dave Hughes just comes up with different numbers than the EIA, and that has to do with some important things with methodology. But just to look at some of the bottom line numbers in Dave Hughes' report from the Post-Carbon Institute, the Drilling Deeper report, he says that 4 of the 7 gas fields are now in terminal decline in terms of their productivity, and going towards 2040 they'll be in steep decline. If you look at the oil fields, the 2 biggest ones, the Eagle Ford Shale and the Bakken Shale, Eagle Ford being in Texas, Bakken being in North Dakota, those 2 fields, which are the most prolific fields, even those 2 will be producing about 1/10 of the amount of oil towards 2040 as they are now. And if you look at gas, there's only 3 fields that are doing well, but even those are starting to peak in terms of their productivity. And what that means is that there's a concept called the drilling treadmill in the industry. You have to drill more and more just to maintain productivity. That means all the things that we know about, which is water contamination, climate change impacts, all of that on a county-by-county basis across the United States, those happen all over the place just so that the industry can maintain at least flat levels of production, but now increasingly declining levels of production. So I think that that's the real story. And then the other real story here is the story of false premises, which is this 100 years of oil and gas in the United States. That's a false promise. So lots of counties think that they're in for a long haul of being enriched by this oil and gas production boom. In reality, for the industry, all it means is this county is sort of a sacrifice zone so that they can, maybe for a few years, maintain this level of production. Once the production plummets, which has about a 3-year, if you look at the report, 3 years is that magic number where these wells start to plummet, then that county is just not really useful anymore for the industry. So these are some of the biggest takeaways from this very long 200-page plus report.
And Carol, this is kind of typical, as Steve pointed out, of what we hear from the industry, that, you know, worry not, we have plenty of natural gas in there that we can frack away for 100 years, maybe 150 years. But clearly that's not what the case is. They want us to think that so they can just keep fracking the hell out of North America, basically.
Yeah, this report brings up a lot of critical issues for fracking in Canada. David Hughes has actually done a similar analysis of projections and forecasts for natural gas development in British Columbia. And I think it's really interesting. I mean, David Hughes actually calls into question the projections and forecasts and information used by the U.S. Energy Information Agency and says, you know, how did you come up with these scenarios? And oftentimes it's a very rosy best case scenario picture. And of course, This report is really focused on, are those projections real? Are they meaningful? And on top of that, I think we have to consider, are these projections meaningful in a real-world context where we're actually trying to move to lower carbon sources of energy? There's another report that DeSmog Canada just reported on that came out in Canada this week by the Pembina Institute that actually, says abundant natural gas will actually prevent BC from taking meaningful climate action. It's not a bridge fuel. It's just preventing and delaying and sort of taking resources away from low carbon sources of energy. So I think that this whole question of our projections on these reserves, whether they're proven or sort of potential reserves, are they meaningful? Are they true? Can we rely on them? And should we really be sort of spending the money and the time and the resources to be developing this resource and this infrastructure at the expense of what are going to be the fuels of the future?
And Brendan, okay, so we have this new report that says there is not nearly enough natural gas to last as long as the industry has told us that it's going to last, as long as some of our politicians have told us that it's going to last. Is this report a shock to the industry, or is it just finally we now know what they knew?
Well, I think for the industry, it's just oh no, they finally caught on to us, just like the tobacco executives who were sweating in front of Congress over, catching up with accountability, catching up to them over their, lies to the American people. We're seeing the oil industry face the same music, and I think it's really humbling to the industry that not only is, the government agencies and these independent analyses like David Hughes showing their, the emperor has no clothes, that they're actually not providing us 100 years of stable, clean energy, and in fact, it's all a ruse. So what we're seeing is that the American people finally have evidence that this, suspicion that everyone has had that the oil industry is lying to us is coming true. So, rather than providing us with a decent energy source for the future, they want us to be locked into these old technologies that they make money off of, but end up hurting us all as citizens.
And Carol, another great story that came out this week, I know it was featured on both DeSmogBlog and DeSmog Canada, is the fact that we have dirty energy lobbyists from Canada who are trying to sway the American midterm election that's coming up next week. Tell us about what's happening there. This whole lobbyists without borders is what I like to call it here.
That's a great name for it. Yeah, there was this report put out by a group called the Shareholder Association for Research and Education, or SHARE for short. And what they did is they just took a close look at companies that were contributing to political issues, oftentimes energy issues in the U.S. from north of the border. And what they found out was that at least 15.3 million has been contributed to various government agencies and the federal government in the U.S. In the first 9 months of 2014. But I think the more interesting thing that this report really focused on is the fact that there are no requirements for disclosure on either side of the border when it comes to quantifying the extent of this spending. So there was money being funneled from, for example, Canadian corporation TransCanada, the proponent of the Keystone XL pipeline, contributed over $1 million on political lobbying from January to September, and then you also see other companies like Barrick Gold and BlackBerry, all these other companies, just lots of Canadian money sort of being funneled south of the border, and of course this becomes an issue of increasing interest when you have midterm elections coming up. So what this report was really saying is, we don't really have a lot of rules in place to disclose this. There's a lot of dark money moving around. There's a lot of contributions going to political action committees or super PACs, and oftentimes this isn't even being tracked, let alone monitored or disclosed in any consistent and significant way.
Brendan, is this what we're going to see now in a post-Citizens United, post-McCutcheon world in the United States? I mean, is this lobbying from outside of the country just going to become the new normal?
Well, I think it's definitely going to continue to happen without any disclosure. The changing landscape means that there's all these sources of money flowing into pollute our democracy with the views of folks who aren't everyday Americans, and that money has contaminated our system, and now there's really less and less disclosure, less and less sunshine to spotlight on these outside spending actors who are absolutely ruining our chances of having a citizen, a representative democracy.
And Steve, I know you've got some very interesting input on this story, so give us your take.
Well, I was at the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission meeting in Columbus, and I won't say too much because there's stories to come, but I do want to preview one small thing that has to do with the Canadian government acting almost as a lobbyist for the fossil fuel industry. So if you look at the meeting, I was at the opening session, and all of the representatives of regulatory agencies from not only the oil and gas producing states in the U.S., but also some of the oil and gas producing provinces in Canada. One of the women from one of the higher ups in Nova Scotia's regulatory agency was talking about what's happening there, and she referred to the, quote, crazies who had stopped fracking in Nova Scotia, and pointed to the fact that she could have some solidarity with Bradley Field, the regulator who oversees oil and gas in New York, and those two kind of laughed at the table together at this. It was sort of symbolic of what happened at large at this meeting, which was regulators acting as guarantors for the oil and gas industry, and it was a very troubling conference to be at. I'll leave it at that for now.
Whenever there's a meeting of dirty energy industry officials and politicians or anybody in the like, it turns out really bad for consumers. And speaking of bad for consumers, Brendan, next week, U.S. midterm election, there's a lot at stake, not just on the federal level, but we have initiatives all over the country to help stop things like fracking in small communities. There are a lot of ballot initiatives from the bottom up that are going to affect U.S. environmental policy. What is at stake next Tuesday?
This is a really key election. I mean, what we're seeing is the oil industry versus the citizenry, and what we're seeing across America, but in particular in key states like California and Texas, where there's a lot of fracking ballot initiatives to either ban fracking or slow it down, or wait for the science to come in on some of these key issues like the threats to water, and particularly in drought-ridden states like Texas and California, that's a key issue. So what you're seeing is the oil industry spending an ungodly amount of money to stop citizens' petitions to their governments for protection from this industry. And in particular, there's one case in California where there are several initiatives. Santa Barbara is one key one, and Mendocino County as well, where you see these citizen initiatives for banning fracking. The oil industry is spending massive amounts of money. To give you one example, there's one front group called Californians for Energy Independence, which sounds like a great thing. In a typical fashion, the front group, set up with a name that's, exactly counter to what it is set up to do. This group has received nearly $8 million in funds to run advertising, billboards, ad campaigns, television, pollution. And this group, 100% funded by oil money, led by Chevron, which has kicked in nearly $3 million, Occidental Petroleum, another $2 million, ExxonMobil's in there. So really, you've got this $8 million juggernaut trying to confuse people about how to vote. The oil industry knows that if there's momentum in California, so goes the nation. So they want to spend big here to stop citizens from exercising their rights to protect their water supplies and the climate from fracking. So they're going all out. Same thing's happening in Texas, as Steve mentioned. There's these outrageous claims being made by industry-funded groups. They're saying that the anti-fracking movement's funded by the Russians. They're trying to gin up all this scare tactics and this fear, because they want people to, in a sense, fear climate solutions, which is, what banning fracking and moving quickly to renewable energy is. It's a solution to this problem. So this group, Californians for Energy Independence, is named, in a very Orwellian fashion, but what it really is, citizens for oil profits, citizens for climate chaos, citizens for water contamination, and it's not what the citizens want. The actual people, and Californians overwhelmingly, according to the polls, are gonna, are ignoring this stuff, and they're gonna vote for these fracking bans. And we just have to hope that democracy can survive in the fragile state that it's in, given the amount of financial pollution that the oil industry's kicked in.
And Steve, can you give us a quick rundown on what's happening down there in Texas? I know there's some very important initiatives happening around Denton.
Yeah, Denton is the one place in Texas that would be the first city to ban fracking in a state that's known as being the kind of the global epicenter of the oil and gas industry. And so, as I talked about with the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission, they've had some key help from regulators acting as servants for the industry. And you look at the Railroad Commission, and Brendan mentioned the stuff with the claims that these anti-fracking activists are funded by Putin. Well, that actually was a claim that originally, in 2 letters from 2 different commissioners on the Railroad Commission, came out and wrote letters over the summer saying that one of them actually wrote a letter to Secretary John Kerry asking him to investigate whether or not that may be the case. And that was just a pure PR move. But actually, if you look at where did it come from, the Railroad Commission hired a guy who used to work for Desenhall Resources. They hired him over the summer as his job is to do, quote, special projects. And one of the projects he's been put up to is producing these claims that anti-fracking activists are funded by Russia. And you look at Desenhall Resources' past, they have a really shady history of doing things such as spying on Greenpeace USA for years, and then almost being held legally accountable, but a U.S. court decided not to bring the charges against them, and a number of other things. But like Brendan said, this is to be expected when activists take on one of the most profitable industries in the world. But the fascinating thing is this is a very close race in Denton. I don't know how it will end up, but this would be unprecedented for a city in Texas to ban fracking in the global epicenter of where the fracking boom really started in the Barnett Shale. And
Carol, I want to end with you here. Obviously, myself, Steve, Brendan, we all live in the United States. You are in Canada, and I just want to get your quick opinion. Just based on everything you've seen, who right now is doing a worse job when it comes to addressing the threat of climate change, and which country do you think is more entrenched with the dirty energy industry?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, there are some major differences, even just the difference in population. So if you want to say, you know, who's doing a worse job, who's sort of more in bed with the oil and gas industry, in some ways, Canada, with the small population that we have and the big influence of industry, a small amount of influence actually adds up to quite a lot, and we have less resources to push back, and smaller media, and so on and so forth. But I really do think that when it comes to suppressing, climate action and suppressing the activities of the green movement, Canada really takes page out of the U.S.'s book. I mean, we only just started muzzling our scientists. The States was way ahead of us on that. So in some ways, we're playing catch up, as we always have with American politics. But it is interesting too when you look at how much more deeply entrenched the oil and gas lobby has been in the U.S. And you guys have this issue of Congress, and I know you have complications with Obama. These sort of big promises that seem to never amount up to what they should when it comes to climate action. But I think that on the sort of outward-facing and international stage, the U.S. has taken a much more serious and meaningful approach to addressing climate action, whereas Canada, I think, has no fear of appearing, as many people have pointed out, an obstructionist on the international climate negotiation scene, and that's rather embarrassing for a lot of Canadians, and I think is going to come back to hurt our reputation and make us perhaps less of a credible country on the international stage. I mean, we're going to be left behind. I think America's a little more savvy on getting with the program. So I think I answered the question a whole bunch of ways there. It's a mixed bag of things, of course.
Right. And I think the biggest problem that the United States has on the international level is that we really are a country that's more do as we say, not as we do. Unfortunately, everybody, that's all the time we have for this week. I want to thank Steve Horn, Carol Linnitt, Brendan DeMelle. I'm Farron Cousins. We'll see you next week, and if you want more, go to DeSmogBlog.com, DeSmog.ca, or DeSmog.UK, and we'll see you all next week.